Welcome into this edition of the Roundtable, and today we're going to do a special edition of our Net Zero Carbon segment brought to you by Convoy, as we talk about the Supreme Court decision that came down last Thursday regarding the Clean Air Act and how much power the EPA has in enforcing those rules. And for more context and analysis on this, we turn to two gentlemen. Number one, Matthew Leffler, our armchair attorney, and then also, check this out, a blast from the past, Tyler Cole, also joining us here as well for this particular discussion. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Good.
All right, let's dive into this. First off, Matt, why did the Supreme Court essentially rule in this? Can you give us just a little bit of an overview of what the case was and why they went in the direction they did?
Absolutely. And I think to begin with, we have to kind of understand what is the administrative state. Administrative law is something that's been recently developed over the last couple of decades. And how it starts is the Congress passes a bill that enables a regulatory agency. And the president signs that and it becomes a law. That agency then has the power to create rules, enforce the rules, and interpret the rules. That agency simply takes on the case of being a judiciary and a legislative and an executive operation. And the question in this case was, did the EPA have the authority in how they were looking to implement this thing called the Clean Power Plan? And what the Supreme Court decided was they did not, under this thing called the Major Questions Doctrine. We can talk about that in a minute, but suffice it to say, what the Supreme Court did in this decision was to say, we don't believe EPA has this authority. And if they want this authority, go back to Congress and get that authority.
Gotcha. Tyler, how much is this a setback right now to those that want to forward the net zero carbon agenda?
I think it's probably less than people might anticipate. I mean, the ruling did not say that EPA cannot regulate emissions, and it did not say that they don't have the power to help the power grid become cleaner. It just is talking about the methods with which they can do that. And if we look at where we're at today compared to 2007, emissions are falling rapidly from the power sector, and the market is continuing to adopt renewables just because they're cheaper. And we will expect to see that to continue, because that's the big thing that everyone's looking for in their supply chain emissions is, how do I reduce Scope 1, Scope 3 emissions from, call it, my tailpipes of my fleet or my transportation, but how also do I reduce my Scope 2 emissions when I'm looking at powering my manufacturing operations? And that's where we see the grid can have an impact on both of those sectors, because if we're getting either renewable energy credits for buying, on-site or off-site wind and solar, and I'm using that explicitly to power my operations, I can also do the same thing with my fleet or my carriers' fleets. And I don't think that's going to slow down. I think people should take a step back and listen to our armchair attorney and understand exactly what this is saying, because it's a blow, and it means that the regulation has to be more pointed and will take longer than we would like to see. But the market's going to continue to do what it's done for the last 15 years, and that's decarbonize at a rapid clip.
Now let's jump back to that big questions argument that you mentioned just a few minutes ago. Even if Congress passes a law and it goes to President Biden, he signs it, it goes forward to the Supreme Court, so on and so forth, as regularly bills do. How much of a fight do you still have? Because you're talking about that major questions issue, whereas does an agency have an ability to have broad sweeping powers over a given area?
That's a great question. And Tyler brought up a phenomenal point. The emission regulation they were trying to achieve, they've hit that in 2019. So just because the law doesn't tell you must become more efficient doesn't mean people aren't going to make that choice for economic reasons or policy reasons. So that is a really important thing to note, is we are going to continue to be more efficient. Now, the major questions doctrine is fascinating. The simple thing of looking at this is whether or not this rule done by an administrative agency would have a substantial impact on the economic or the public policy of our country. The most recent case I can think about that talks about the major questions doctrine is the case where OSHA was looking to mandate vaccinations for employers over 100 people. And the Supreme Court came and said, look, OSHA doesn't have that authority granted to them. It's nowhere written in that document. If they want that authority, they have to ask for it. You have to think about administrative administrative agencies not that dissimilar from a planet that's forming in an accretion disk during the solar system's formation. Power begets more power, and these agencies over time take on more and more power. And the only check that they typically have is by you appeal to these federal court systems. But the federal courts have historically said, we're going to give deference to this agency. We're not going to question what they're doing. But the major questions doctrine is a way to circumvent the overall deference given to an agency so that you can then look at the underlying statute and say, did we really want to give that agency that much power? And we will see a lot of these rules coming out of all number of federal agencies being challenged under this major questions doctrine.
Carol, let me go back to you in that this idea, this particular bill, and the way that the EPA was going to be used, and it seemed like a bit of a blanket solution for those that are looking for more net zero carbon regulation to make sure that these emissions continue to keep going down. Obviously, now with this at least temporarily not feasible at that particular moment, are there other alternatives in this ESG and the G part being talked about here? Are there other alternatives that can be used other than, for instance, as you mentioned, market influence?
Absolutely. And the G and ESG is not specifically about the federal government, right? We're going to look at how corporates are governing their operations as well as local municipalities and subnational regions. And honestly, that's where most of the recent movement in climate policy has taken. In absence of the federal government moving in a heavy-handed way, you've seen states and regional and local and municipal governments enact regulations that move the market forward and accelerate some of this new technology we're seeing in a decarbonized environment. So you take California's low carbon fuel standard, you look at what some other states are doing about having their own renewable portfolio, which is essentially their own statewide clean air, or have to help me on this armchair attorney. What's the clean power plan? The states have their own renewable portfolios where they have increasing percentages of renewables that they want to displace other power generating activities. And that's fine because the states can do that. What this is saying is that the EPA just has to use different tools in order to try and move the ball down the field. They can't be as heavy handed as they were. And in truth, this plan was not even it was repealed by the Trump administration and never put in by Obama anyway. So we've actually seen all this progress over the last 15 years coming despite a federal disagreement or gridlock, you might call, on major environmental policy. So I'm not concerned about momentum slowing down. Everybody is aware and sees, and younger generations are rising up, and this is higher and higher on their agenda to try and have climate policy. And it's honestly a great market opportunity for new technologies to come and start challenging some of these incumbents that are really, really deeply entrenched in markets all over the world. So it's an exciting time. This definitely, it would help to have federal momentum at your back, but we also want to be really cautious and grateful that we live in a country where we have these necessary checks and balances.
Matt, let me move back to you here in terms of not just the constitutional aspect of this, but also maybe just the issue in and of itself. How much of a fight do you see legally between those entities that want to see net zero carbon standards achieved and those that are maybe more focused on their business in terms of how they do what they do in order to make money? How much of a fight are we in for over the course of the next 10, 15 years as these goals become more and more present as we move forward to these 2035, 2040, 2050 deadlines that are coming up?
What I want to focus on here is that the cost of fuel is your biggest driver for trucking and over-the-road supply chain stuff. And as long as those realities remain, we are going to continue to explore different types of fuel and powertrains and ways to reduce carbon emissions as ancillary to the cost reduction aspect of this. As cost goes down for these alternative fuel systems and infrastructure improves, you will have massive adoption. It will continue to happen. In terms of the fights that we'll see between the federal agencies that might be looking to regulate these things, I don't think it's going to always be political. It's always going to be vicious to a certain extent, but the trends and forces are the trends and forces. You don't get to opt out of these things and how they move. And so ultimately, we will see more efficient vehicles and more efficient ways of generation of power because it's more cost effective and it's more sustainable. And once the economic interests align with more renewable sources of power, that is the path that we're going to go. What I do anticipate with this case, specifically around the major questions doctrine, is many federal rules for all sorts of things impact economic interests and impact the population. And people will be suing far, far more over the next 5, 10, maybe even 15 years under these theories of, hey, I don't like that agency's ruling. I want to challenge it as a major question and try to overrun this idea of the Chevron deference, which is just a way of saying if an agency says something, we're generally going to believe what they say.
Tyler, let me just continue on that same line of thinking to you in terms of how these, for instance, alternative fuels, EV vehicles, adoption, that kind of thing. Is this a setback right now for those things as well, or do you see this still just kind of plowing forward as it was to your market influence point?
I think it's going to continue to plow forward. We've seen too much investment. And you've got to remember that a lot of these firms that are putting out these new low carbon fuels or these electrified vehicles or powertrains, they're global companies. And so the US market is not the only market that they have to consider. And there are other regulatory regions around the world that are more heavy handed than our EPA and our federal government. So we can take our cue from what's happening elsewhere in the world to understand where the trends are and where those drivers are. And to Matt's point, once we get the necessary scope and scale of production for some of these technologies, adoption will rapidly follow. And so I'm not saying we need to abstain and not be intentional with our regulatory policies, but we don't have to be a heavy-handed first mover, and we certainly can't pick winners and losers in the market. So when you look at technologies like electrification or hydrogen or e-fuels, which is where I'm at now, a technology that I'm really excited about, it is going to be a competition for market share that's going to be determined by cost effectiveness as well as performance opportunities. And it's going to be slow rolling and start taking shape by appropriate sectors, appropriate duty cycles. Geographies may have different natural resources that they can tap into. So it's going to be a really interesting next 10 to 15 years, to your point, but I don't believe there's anything that's going to slow down the momentum. We might end up using just as much fossil fuels in 10 years as we are today, just because of global economic growth. But we're going to see an increasing percentage of market share, both in terms of year over year share growth and just total volume going to renewables and low carbon fuels.
Well, it's certainly going to be an interesting question in terms of how we move forward with all this. Matt and Tyler, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see how this discussion plays out and how things move forward.
Excited to check back again soon.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. We'll take a short break, come back and finish up our edition of FreightWaves Now right after this.